Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 25th of September. I'm Andrew Wilson, and welcome to the Full Scottish. This afternoon, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 214 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our two guests for this afternoon, and then together we will look in a little more depth at the past week's key headlines from Scotland and around the world. More than 730 people were detained across Russia at the latest protests against the country's mobilization decree, our human rights group said, 3 days after President Vladimir Putin ordered the country's first military draft since the Second World War. A new law signed by President Putin says Russian troops who refuse to fight, who desert, disobey or surrender to the enemy could now face a jail sentence of up to 10 years. That's according to Russian media reports. The law was approved by the Russian parliament last week. Russia's deputy defense minister, Dmitry Bulgakov, has been dismissed from his post. Bulgakov, who has been in charge of military logistics since the beginning of the Ukraine invasion, has been replaced by Colonel General Mikhail Mizintsev, the head of the National Defense Management Center, who oversaw Russia's siege of Mariupol. Sergei Lavrov has said that the Ukrainian regions where votes are underway would be under Moscow's full protection if they were annexed by Russia, including with nuclear weapons. The so-called referendums are underway in Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia provinces, areas of Ukraine occupied by Russian troops, with residents told to vote on proposals to declare independence and then join Russia. The polls are due to run until Tuesday. Russian authorities in the occupied regions of Zaporizhia and Kherson have allegedly started handing out draft notices and mobilizing men of conscription age who renounced Ukrainian citizenship and received passports of the Russian Federation, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. President Volodymyr Zelensky told Ukrainians in occupied territory to hide from Russian mobilization, avoid conscription letters, and get to Ukrainian-held territory. However, if they ended up in the Russian military, Zelensky asked people to save their lives and help to liberate Ukraine. Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, told the United Nations General Assembly that China supports all efforts conducive to the peaceful resolution of the crisis in Ukraine. The queue at the border between Russia and Georgia is about 10 kilometers long, where people have reportedly been waiting more than 20 hours to cross. The number of border crossings from Russia into Finland has doubled in recent days compared with last week. 2 civilians were killed in attacks in Ukraine's Donetsk region on Friday, and 3 were injured, and that's according to Pavlo Kyrylenko, the governor of the Donetsk Oblast. Russian forces also shelled settlements near the Russian border. In the Kupian district, 5 people were injured from shelling, including 2 children aged 10 and 17. And Russian forces are probably trying to attack dams in Ukraine in order to flood Ukrainian military crossing points, amid Russian concerns about battlefield setbacks. That's according to the latest UK Ministry of Defence briefing. Now, I'm delighted to say that we are lucky enough to be joined by 2 excellent guests this afternoon. Serena Cowdy is a councillor on Angus Council representing Arbroath West. Serena has worked as a consumer rights and personal finance journalist for various publications and also covered political issues for The House, which is the in-house magazine of the Houses of Parliament, Huffington Post and Politics Home. Serena, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Serena. Serena, we really appreciate your time. And Paul McLennan MSP has been the MSP for East Lothian since 2021. Previously, he served as a local councillor for the Dunbar and East Linton multi-member ward of East Lothian Council since 2007 and was both the SNP group leader and the council leader from 2007 to 2012. Paul has also been a board member of NHS Lothian, the regional offices of Scottish Enterprise and the Commission on School Reform. Paul, thank you for joining us on the Full Scottish this afternoon. How are you keeping?
Yeah, I'm good, Andrew. A little bit joyous after the Scotland game last night. Late night getting back from the game, but well worth it. So it was very good.
Of course, of course. I think we all enjoyed that match last night. Paul, there's one thing. Just before we came on air, we were sad to learn that Chick Brodie, the former SNP MSP for South of Scotland, has passed away after a short illness. Our thoughts are with Mary and his whole family. Paul, I think you worked with Mr. Brodie.
Yeah, I worked with Chick for 5 years, from 2012, 4 years, just over 4 years, from 2012 to 2017. Yeah, Chick was a character. I think that was the way that everybody would kind of describe him. He was unique. He was one of his own. Many memories of Chick, happy memories of Chick. So I wasn't aware he was ill. So it came as a real shock last night when I had a few messages from people informing me he'll be well missed. He lit up Scottish politics, let's say, and was a character. And I still remember one of my first acquaintances with Chick when he's been in at SNP conference when he done his impersonation of Elvis. So, I think many people will recall that at conference times when he had done his Elvis impersonations. So, yeah, sad this morning, really sad this morning, and he'll be missed. Chick will be missed.
Thanks, Paul. Some great memories there, and as I say, Chick's family are in all our thoughts this afternoon.
Yeah.
Now, let's start our first story now, because more than 2,000 people in total have been detained across Russia for protesting against Vladimir Putin's partial military mobilization. That's including 798 people detained in 33 towns yesterday. And that's according to the independent monitoring group OVD Info. Reuters reports that concern has even spread to pro-Kremlin media, with one editor at RT News saying problems such as call-up papers being sent to the wrong people were infuriating people. And Valentina Matviyenko, who's the chairwoman of Russia's upper house, the Federation Council, said she was aware of reports of men who should be ineligible for the draft being called up. Such excesses are absolutely unacceptable, and I consider it absolutely right that they are triggering a sharp reaction in society, she said in a post on the Telegram messaging app. So, Serena, firstly with you, are these reports of both of protests, of widespread arrests, and politicians and journalists objecting to the way in which the partial military mobilization is being put into effect, does that suggest to you that perhaps people are unhappy at the prospect of being sent to Ukraine to fight and die?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing to say is, very sadly, this is not surprising at all. We all know that Putin said there wasn't going to be a partial mobilization. He's also said lots of other things that have turned out to be completely untrue. So I think it's a sign of desperation in the Russian state apparatus, and I think it's a sign that they are losing the war. But in terms of the individuals who are now protesting, I've seen some quite harsh words against them, to the effect of, well, they weren't protesting when Ukrainians were being sent to die or being put to death by the Russian soldiers. They're only protesting now because they're being sent themselves. I just think that's really unhelpful, because we don't know what everybody's individual situation is. We don't know really. Anyone who protests in Russia is facing a long jail term. So I don't think we can be the moral compass of that situation. But yeah, it's hideous, it's expected, and yes, of course, I hope it triggers a wave of further public resistance, but it's at such great cost to these individuals' lives.
Completely, Serena, thank you. And as you said, indications perhaps of desperation. Paul, Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, says the 4 Ukrainian regions where votes are now underway in sham referendums will be under Moscow's full protection if they are annexed. At a news conference in New York, Lavrov said that Russian territory, and that he defined that as including territory further enshrined in Russia's constitution in the future, is under the full protection of the state. All of the laws, doctrines, concepts, and strategies of the Russian Federation apply to all of its territory. He said all of its territory. So that strikes me as clear evidence that what is going on here is a war of imperial ambition.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. We've already seen that with Crimea and other parts of what Russia has been trying to move towards, and I think they've got ambitions in other parts as well as what they see as Greater Russia. I think the worrying thing, I think, for me is obviously at the moment NATO are supplying weapons to Ukrainians, and they're being used obviously in these regions. Russia is now saying obviously it would be under its full protection. They would I think they've mentioned, Lavrov and Putin have mentioned, that this would be if NATO weapons are used on what they would call these areas now, they would see that as an attack on Russia. So it's a big game of bluff. I think it's been called here, and I think that's the worrying thing. I think for myself on that, and I think we're really reaching the crossroads of this war situation just now. Even with the mobilisation, it's going to take 3 or 4 months for these soldiers to be trained, to be armed, to be equipped, to get on the battlefield, if you like. So there's a long winter period ahead, which I think the Russian military might find tough at this stage. So I think we're really at a crossroads, because I think, as Serena is saying as well, there are now rumblings, not only within the general populace, but within, I suppose, pro-Kremlin, journalists and so on at the moment, that they're beginning to turn against Putin. So I think the next 3 or 4 months before that the forces are fully mobilised, it depends where the war goes, you may see more protests against Putin.
Thanks, Paul. And Serena, you used the word desperate, and there's been discussion over the weekend about what kind of reaction we might see from President Putin, insofar as if his levels of desperation are increasing, if he's starting to feel threatened or cornered. So, do you think is President Putin risking losing at home in Russia as well as on the battlefields across Ukraine?
Well, I think you have to think about what would Putin define as losing at home. I'm by no means an expert on psychology, but lots of people have diagnosed him using very well established diagnostic tools as a psychopath. And that means he doesn't have really any empathy. He also doesn't have an understanding of how normal people's minds work. I personally don't think he's got his finger on the button of the actual attitudes within Russia. So his version of losing, what is that? Is it losing his personal pride, losing his position in history? Is it the international community somehow supporting Ukraine in taking back all the territory? I think it's a bit more complex than what many people would see, because he's got such a specific psychological makeup. So I think we need to define what he would consider as losing. And I don't know quite what that is. I know he wants to build a mother Russia that encompasses lots more territory. So yes, losing the Ukrainian territories would be what you'd conventionally describe as losing. But I think losing face is really what Putin fears the most.
That's a very good point, Serena. It certainly strikes me that the similarities perhaps with Trump in terms of having very, very fragile egos. And I'm grateful to you for taking us inside Vladimir Putin's head on a Sunday afternoon. That's quite the most alarming thing that's happened so far this weekend. But it is. So, Paul, do you think, in terms of Putin's response to the way in which the war has been prosecuted, is this a representation of what might otherwise be called Napoleon syndrome? He's a small man who's overstepped and has gone too far.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that, and I think at the start of the week, before he made his televised appearance, he obviously he'd met with President Erdogan of Turkey, and President Erdogan obviously came out and said that Putin was looking for a way out. So at the moment, I think he was at that crossroads. Does he try and back down, find a way out, or does he try and, I suppose, toughen up and look at what he's doing now? Obviously, he took a step in terms of toughening up his response, but I think there must be thoughts in the back of his head that he is losing this. What is a way out of this? And this is a dangerous position. Does he go full on in terms of what he's doing in mobilisation, or did he try and look for a way out? Obviously, he's looked for the full mobilisation, but I think there must be doubts in his own head, and that's, I think, is backed up with discussions that President Erdogan came out and said that he had directly with President Putin. And again, I think, if the military start to turn against President Putin, if the media start to turn against President Putin, it's going to be interesting to see what's happening in the next 3 or 4 months, because mobilisation won't take real effect, as I said, for about 3 or 4 months until that comes in. There's a tough winter period ahead for President Putin and his troops. If the Ukrainians make more advances, I think we really could start to see a push from within Russia around about President Putin being removed. Still a long way off. I still think that's unlikely, but I think the chances of that happening are growing, and will continue to grow over the winter period.
Thanks, Paul. It's a truism that every political career ends in failure, but even what strikes me even more so, the career of every autocrat and despot ends. It only ever ends one way. But we'll continue to watch as things develop in Russia and Ukraine, and I'm sure that we will be discussing those events here on Broadcasting Scotland with both of you in the future. But we should move on now, because Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi on Saturday blamed conspirators for inciting unrest and pledged to crack down on those who oppose the country's security and tranquility. Up to 35 people have been killed during clashes with security forces, according to Iran. Iranian officials said 5 security personnel have also died trying to quell outrage surrounding the death of Masa Amini, who was 22. But activists say that the death toll is at least 50, unlikely to be even higher. Some demonstrations appear to have at least in part been organised, with arrest of urban youth and others opposed to strict societal rules, including on how women conduct themselves and what they wear, coalescing around the death of Amini, who was accosted by the morality police in Tehran for refusing to wear a hijab. Drawing on lessons learned over the past decade in anti-government uprisings elsewhere in the Middle East, smartphones have been used as organising tools, with messages and places of demonstrations widely circulated. That's despite cuts to the country's internet. Iran doesn't have enough military forces to stop all these protesters. The police are saying that if this situation continues for more than 2 or 3 days, they won't be able to handle it anymore, said one eyewitness. So, Serena, firstly with you, are you surprised by reports of widespread protesting against the Raisi regime, and also videos and more reports of men taking steps to support women and to join them in defending their rights in Iran?
I'm surprised because I'm just blown away by the bravery of these people. The Islamic Revolution in 1979 is when women were forced to wear headscarves and or face jail. So a lot of these, and it is a lot of them, are women, young women, very young women protesting. They weren't even born when these restrictions came into place. So they don't have a memory of a freer society, and yet still they are putting their lives at risk to try and champion that and push for that again. And I think that's what's surprising to me, is that it's just incredible bravery in the face of possible death. And we've seen reports that live ammunition is being fired into these crowds. So as you've said, several people have, probably many people have already died. So I'm surprised because it's a amazing show of human courage. I'm actually not as surprised that the men are supporting the women. I think it's people all over the world are the same, and I think when it comes to it, most people are good, and most people will try and do the right thing. And I don't think that the divide between men and women in Iran is maybe quite as different as we all thought it was. I think it's more the divide between the authorities and the normal people. The only other sort of point I would make, and it actually relates back to the conversation we were having about Ukraine, is that it seems that all authoritarian regimes, the one thing they absolutely cannot handle is social media. It's a very good example of social media being a force for good. They're losing the information war, just like in Russia, where Putin was saying men deserting the draft were a lie. And then you saw all these videos from social media about thousands of them trying to get across the border. So again, in this instance, I think, yes, the Iranians say it has tried to crack down on social media, but I think they've done it too late. And that's what's great, is that we are seeing what's happening. And that's, as I say, one of the real benefits of the internet.
Thanks, Serena. Now, Paul, Serena makes a good point there regarding social media and the use of technology in terms of organising, and similarities have been drawn between the events in Iran with the so-called Arab Spring. Do you think that there is a possibility or the prospect of a repeat of what became called the Arab Spring, but this time in Iran?
Yeah, I think we've seen in the past number of years, that there have been protests in Iran, which are quite quickly curbed. I think this time it looks different, it feels different, and like we've still seen social media where you have seen women taking their hijabs off and headscarves off and quite openly protesting on the streets in that regard. So it does feel different. I think the point around about men supporting that, the general populace, is incredibly important. I think if we continue to see that, then the regime faces a choice. Does it begin to crack down like it has in the past? The genie's out the bottle, if you like, I think, in this one, because you do see social media, it is out there, it is being shared. So yeah, again, I think the next week to 10 days are going to be incredibly important. Does the momentum continue to grow in this? I think these are the real important things when you start to see, like the Arab Spring, momentum grew every single day till it became a situation that the state itself couldn't handle that. And I think the next week to 10 days will be incredibly important. If the momentum continues to build, I think the regime faces real difficulties in trying to control that. So let's hope that the populace of Iran can move towards that. And I'm old enough to remember going back when I was about 11 or 12 when the Islamic Revolution came in, just how quickly overnight Iranian society changed. And that, there'll still be people with a lot of memories of having these freedoms at that particular time, which I think will push that. So next week to 10 days I think is going to be incredibly important.
That's a good point, Paul. I'm old enough as well to remember. I remember people seeking refuge from the revolution, seeking refuge in Edinburgh at the time. So yes, I think we're likely to see more of that. But Serena, I was going to ask you: do you think? The other point, Paul, was just that I think there's research from Boston that says that if you get 3.5% of the population onto the street, then you will get regime change. So we'll wait and see the extent to which the protests grow. But Serena, is the fallout from the death in custody of Mahsa Amini, do you think, will it be the catalyst for change which might bring down the Iranian regime?
I hope so. I hope so much. I think the only caveat I would make is it's very easy for people like me to sit in a safe country very far away, whether that's ideologically or geographically far away, and sort of encourage people to protest and say, yes, you can do this. And then in the case of the Arab Spring, a lot of it went very wrong. And a lot of the things that those people were pushing for, they didn't happen, or they happened and then they were brutally suppressed. So I hope so much that that's the case. And it's really interesting, the 3.5%. I've never heard that before. So that's a really interesting one. There are alternative parties and organizations who are putting forward their own more liberal agendas in Iran. And so I hope it happens. I just don't want to be flippant or be off the cuff about it, because there is so much at risk for these people.
That's a very good point, Serena. I think there are still some hostages in Iran, even though that Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe has been repatriated to the UK, and so yes, it's a very different situation for everyone who's currently in Iran in comparison to, as you say, those of us who are sitting, for example, in Scotland or in the UK. But let's move on to our next item now, because I think there's quite a lot to discuss, because Liz Truss's plan for growth, and if it's fair to call it her plan, melding the biggest tax giveaway in half a century with Thatcherite deregulation, is a straight-up gamble with everyone's future. And even before the Chancellor sat down on Friday morning, that bet was starting to turn sour. The verdict of the financial markets on the at least £220 billion gamble was swift and pretty clear. Sterling crashed below $1.11 for the first time since 1985, and that means that the value of the pound has slumped against the dollar by nearly 20% this year. The only bigger tax cuts were by Nigel Lawson in 1988 and Tony Barber in 1972, I think, and both of those tax-cutting bonanzas crashed the UK economy. So, Paul, firstly with you, bearing in mind what we saw in 1972, after 1972 and after 1988, is that what we're going to see again, a national economy crashed following a Tory tax giveaway?
I think at the moment, even before the mini budget came in, we had to recognise the weakness of the UK economy. Its lowest growth rate in the G20. It's got the highest inflation rate in the G7. In terms of that, sterling, as you said, has dropped around it was about 18% even before Friday. In that regards, we're now heading towards a recession. So the economy was already incredibly weak at that point of view. I think you just have to see the reaction of the markets, as you said on Friday. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the markets in the next couple of days, on Monday and Tuesday, in regards to where they are. I think there's a real potential for the markets to crash, and the UK economy to crash even quicker. And one of the most, I suppose, damning indictments, and reading from, it was Paul Johnson, IFS, who's the director of IFS, said, the Chancellor's announced the biggest package of tax cuts 50 years without even a semblance of an effort to make the public numbers add up. That's the reason why you're seeing the pound drop so quickly, because if people think that they're going to invest in the UK and an economy that's going to grow, then they would. The very reason that they're actually shorting on this is an indictment of how far they're seeing the UK economy has dropped. So yeah, I think there's a real potential of that, and you're seeing Kwasi Kwarteng come out over the weekend and still trying to defend it. And the most important thing, I think, for yes, it harms the economy. There is nothing in this budget at all to help the most vulnerable in our society. Absolutely nothing. The exact opposite. And this is a real crossroads in politics in Scotland. We are now facing an attack, and a real full out-and-out attack on poor in Scotland by this Conservative government. This is the most ideological government since Thatcherite days. Make no mistake about that. And people now, this is the job for Serena and I and others within the independence movement to make people realise there is a choice, that this doesn't have to be the way to go ahead. And it's incredible when you actually look at what's been delivered. It's absolutely incredible. They're very, very clearly open around about supporting the better off in our society. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. But yes, coming back to the point you made, Andrew, I think we'll see the markets come under real pressure this week.
And Paul, staying with you for a moment, it's an interesting point that you make with regard to the Thatcherite nature of what we're seeing. I checked, and at the last general election, the Tory candidate in East Lothian polled 50,523 votes. And at the last Scottish election, the same candidate, Craig Hoy, polled 9,470 votes. So how do you think, or what are you hearing in East Lothian? How are those Tory voters reacting to this news and to the right-wing Thatcher cosplaying shambles of a government?
I think you'll probably see the most right-wing of the Tories probably support this. But to be quite honest, in that regard, and it comes back to, you actually seen Tory MSPs come out over the weekend, including Craig Hoy, who's a regional MSP, supporting the budget. Not a thing about supporting the most vulnerable, and that this is a budget for their hard right-wing core. Make no mistake about it. And this is aimed obviously towards an election in 2023 or 2024 about trying to, I suppose, strengthen their vote down south. I'm not sure what it'll do in terms of what they call the blue wall, red wall, whatever you want to call it now. I think there's going to be a real issue in terms of that, and I think this is almost the last throw of the dice for the Tories. And in East Lothian, it's not going down well at all in terms of poverty organisations. They were looking for support in the budget. They got absolutely nothing at all. And this is going to impact. And we're facing a tsunami of issues coming up this winter in terms of the cost of living crisis, be it fuel poverty, heat poverty, food bank usage. These numbers are ballooning out of proportion at the moment. So we're really facing a major crisis with a budget that is doing absolutely nothing to support the most vulnerable, and that will impact on Tories in East Lothian, in Scotland, and it may toughen up the support in the south of England, but it's doing nothing up in Scotland anyway, that's for sure.
Thanks, Paul. That's a very good point. Serena, I was going to ask you, is it, with regard to the wider politics of this, is it at all appropriate in the 21st century that an old Etonian chancellor who read classics at university can sack the most senior civil servant in the Treasury and then unveil a budget which nobody voted for? And now we see that this budget has been released with no scrutiny, either in Parliament or by the Office of Budget Responsibility. So there's no mandate for this budget. There's no mandate for this whole agenda. This entire clusterbook is completely and utterly illegitimate. And is that consistent? Because perhaps with Truss and her financial backers knowing it, that's why we've seen such an immediate smash and grab.
Well, I think it's consistent with what the Conservative Party's been doing in the last several years, which is pretty hideous. I think this is what happens when you start moving away from the established forms of representative democracy and the systems that are in place to safeguard people. Make no mistake, this is halfway down the road to being something very, very dark. We're not at the beginning of that path. We're a long way down that path, and everyone needs to try and stop it or escape from it if they possibly can. So obviously in Scotland, we have a plan, and we really need to move as far away from this situation as possible. But in England, I mean, I've said this before, I feel absolutely heartbroken for people in England. There's so many people that don't agree with what's happening. I've got family who are absolutely up in arms about what's happening. And the alternatives are pretty lackluster at the minute. Let's just put it that way. In terms of a chancellor who comes from the privileged background you describe, that makes me really sad, because Liz Truss made a lot of the fact that it was technically the most diverse cabinet ever. And I think she said, I think that the kind of line is that there's not a white man in any of the top positions in the cabinet, which is, great on paper. But if you actually look at the background of the people who are in the cabinet, it's no more diverse than ever in terms of the privilege and background that these people have come from. So I think also I would just say that as a local councillor, one of the things that is my top priority is to support and protect the most vulnerable in society, as Paul said. And I can't believe that councillors from other parties don't feel that way as well. I must hang on to the notion that other councillors, including those in the Conservative Party, are also concerned and prioritising the most vulnerable. So I really don't think they could be comfortable with this budget. I really hope they're not comfortable with it. Otherwise, my belief in human nature is kind of crushed.
No, it's a very good point, Serena. In the wee quiet dark hours of the morning, you do wonder what is going through some people's minds. Paul, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the politics of this from a Scottish perspective, as taxation policy, in particular income taxation policy, continues to diverge between Westminster and Holyrood. What do you think the political impact might be? I mean, unionists are already demanding that Scotland follow Westminster, and that's despite, as our good friend Professor John Robertson pointing out this morning, there is no evidence whatsoever of any correlation between taxation and migration, exploding the myth that wealthy taxpayers will move to England, where they've just been given a bung by an unelected government. So what do you think we're going to see in Scottish politics as a result of Friday's budget, Paul?
Yeah, I think you're right. There is no evidence to support that. We've seen the right-wing press, even the likes of the Scotsman, came out and saying, that in their words, the Scottish Government is under intense pressure to follow what the UK Government has done. I think you're seeing Conservative MSPs come out this weekend saying the same thing. This is a real quandary for where the Labour Party sit and where they come from in this regard. Only last week, I sit in the Social Security Committee at the Parliament. Last week, we had the Child Poverty Action Group in asking for Scottish Government to raise taxes to tackle child poverty in terms of this use its tax raising powers. Now, we don't have enough powers in terms of that. Yes, we could raise the rate of income tax. We don't have power over allowances. We don't have additional borrowing powers and so on. So, you're already seeing pressure, I suppose, from the Tories to follow suit. For me, I think John Swinney very clearly came out and said, they'll be analysing what they'll be doing. I would be very surprised if Scottish Government follows suit in that regard. We're already facing pressures in the Scottish budget through no fault of our own. John Swinney came out just a few weeks ago and said the budget, Scottish budget, was being affected £1.7 billion because of inflation. We can't do anything about inflation. We aren't getting additional funds from the UK Government on that particular issue. And I had to say on that same committee meeting last Thursday, Jeremy Balfour, a Conservative MSP, actually came out and said, under a fixed budget such as Scottish Government has, there will always be losers. There will always be losers. It's a choice of who loses out. That's what he actually said, which was incredible. So even Tory MSPs know with a fixed budget, there are losers, yet they will not support giving additional borrowing powers to the Scottish Government. So I would hope and I would expect the Scottish Government to stay firm in terms of that and not drop the rates. There is no evidence, as you said, for people migrating. But my priority in politics always will be is protecting the most vulnerable in our society. We have to do as much as we can to try and tackle child poverty, for example. And the Scottish Government has a good record, for example, through the child payment, which isn't available in any other parts of the UK. We have to stand firm in that, despite pressures from a right-wing press.
That's a very good point, Paul. Although I must say, I was just recovering from Serena having taken us inside Vladimir Putin's head, and then you go and mention Jeremy Balfour. But we'll try and recover from that, because Serena, I was going to talk to you about the point that Paul was just making, and was getting to the response to unionist politicians demanding that Scotland follow Westminster's economic policy has been widely responded to by people pointing out that in Scotland council tax is lower, public services especially are perform better, crime is lower, university education is free at the point of consumption, dentistry is for some and will become for more free when you consume it, just like prescriptions. You've got travel that's free for young people in the over 60s. You've got baby boxes, a huge range of measures that the Scottish Government has taken in order to improve people's lives. And Paul, of course, mentions the Scottish Child Payment, which happens nowhere else across the UK. So do you think, Serena, that voters generally understand and perceive the benefits that the divergence in taxation policy has brought to them, or as I was discussing with some activists yesterday, is there perhaps a political problem here, insofar as the Scottish Government does so much to mitigate the damage that Westminster economic policy does, £720 million a year, I think, that the people in Scotland don't yet really understand the implications and the pain which this set of Tory economic policies are going to bring.
I think there's a really interesting point you make around what do people understand about the political system in which they live. And I think unless you're very politically educated and you keep a very close eye on things, I don't think many people fully understand the difference between devolved and reserved powers in the Scottish Parliament. So I'd say at least half of the people I know wouldn't be able to describe exactly what's reserved and what's devolved in terms of the different areas of government. So I think some things have been really well communicated and people know about the baby boxes and they know about the free prescriptions. But when it comes to things that are considered a bit drier or less tangible or even more boring, like the tax system, I think it's fair to say that people don't really fully understand, generally speaking, the minutiae of that. They might have a general understanding that the tax system in Scotland is more progressive than in England, and there is such clear blue water between the two governments now that I think more people are beginning to understand that. But I think there's a piece of work to be done and redone again and again around communicating at a very engaging and accessible level about exactly what the tax system is and how it's different. I think that's correct.
Thanks, Serena. And just it may be worth reminding people that agriculture, forestry, fisheries, education, training, environment, social services, housing, land use planning, policing, justice, local government, sport, the arts, some forms of taxation, some forms of welfare, many aspects of transport, and crucially health are all devolved to Holyrood. Now then, finally, Paul, the SNP's Westminster leader, Ian Blackford, is demanding that the UK Parliament is recalled so that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng can, in his words, be held to account for the depth of the damage caused by the inequality and incompetence of the budget, which has triggered a major financial crisis. He said that the Prime Minister and her government have taken one of the biggest, most reckless right-wing financial gambles in decades and are dodging all scrutiny on the devastating chaos it has created. They cannot be allowed to hide. So, Paul, with an 80-seat majority in the House of Commons, what prospects are there, and a government which is apparently determined to avoid scrutiny, what prospects are there, Paul, for holding this government to account for what they've done?
I'd be very doubtful of proper scrutiny. I think, Andrew, we've discussed this issue before when we've talked about this government trying to avoid scrutiny. And that's a real issue, and I think it was made the point before around about, the biggest tax cuts or whatever you want to look at within 50 years, there is no scrutiny, no chance to debate, no ability to debate it. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. I think through Boris Johnson, you've seen the avoidance of scrutiny. We've seen now with Liz Truss almost following suit in this regard, trying to avoid scrutiny in that regard. And we often seen with Boris Johnson, if he really dove into the detail, the policies fell apart, and I think you will see this in terms of, you're already seeing financial analysts looking at this and pulling this budget apart, and I think you will see this over the next week again. The budget will be pulled apart, hence why you'll get the pressures on the markets. But in terms of looking for proper scrutiny, I think they will ignore Ian in Blackford. I think they will ignore any call for proper scrutiny of the budget, and they're literally playing everybody's finances at this stage without any proper scrutiny. So I would be very doubtful, but it's indicative of this Conservative government, who has an 80-seat majority, think it can do whatever it wants and avoid scrutiny.
Thanks, Paul. That's a very good point. But let's move on now, because the SNP has labelled Gordon Brown's latest leaked Labour paper proposing constitutional reform as Broon's Brigadoon, a plan that magically emerges from the mist before vanishing as quickly as it appeared. The latest version includes the mythical Labour plan to abolish the anachronistic House of Lords, a proposal the Labour Party first made in 1910 and which remains undelivered 112 years later. And the proposals for replacing the Lords have appeared in their past 4 manifestos, with the replacement specifically being a Senate of the Nations and Regions in the past 3 manifestos. And that's a proposal that Gordon Brown announced more than 2 years ago. The SNP's deputy leader, Keith Brown MSP, said Labour has been promising to abolish the Lords for the past 112 years, but despite having been in government 6 times for a total of 33 years, it has never come close to honouring that promise. There are Disney films more believable than Broon's Brigadoon. This is just another repeat of his same old, which magically emerges from the mist before vanishing just as quickly as it appeared. Labour really do appear to think that Scottish people's heads button up the back. Broon's Brigadoon is not just fictitious, it is now so watered down it also breaks his promise in 2014 that Scotland would have the maximum possible devolution and the closest thing to federalism within 2 years. So, Serena, firstly coming to you, does British Labour and Scotland really think that Scottish people's heads button up the back?
Well, I think one of the problems for the Labour Party, for the UK-wide Labour Party, is that the southern bit doesn't really have any understanding of what's happening in the north. So Keir Starmer's made various statements about what he thinks needs to happen in Scotland, which bear very little relation to evidence that shows what Scottish Labour voters actually think. So the latest evidence, which I think we'll come on to a bit later, is that almost 4 in 10 Scottish Labour voters actually support independence, which is never referenced by the Labour Party in Westminster. So I think there's a problematic divide for the Labour Party between what I would call their branch office in Scotland and where the strings are really pulled, as it were, in Westminster.
Thanks, Serena. And yes, and we'll come on to that point you just made, which comes from the British Social Attitude Survey that was published last week. We'll come back to that in a moment. But Paul, what does it tell us about the state of the Labour Party, particularly in Scotland, that the only message they send is delivered by the Gorgon, the Brownosaurus, and that message is one that they've been promising to deliver for more than a century and never have?
Yeah, it's almost becoming laughable now. We hear Gordon Brown being rolled out every year or two with these supposed ideas. The major fault with this one, he talks about the Senate of the Nations and the Regions. There is no support within the regions for this kind of devolvement. We've already seen that discussed, debated and voted upon. There is no support within the regions. Even where you think there would be most support in the north, they weren't supported. There is absolutely no chance of it happening in the south of England in terms of the regions coming together to look at that. So it's facing failure even before it starts. And you're right, it comes back to 2014, where Gordon Brown came out and said that Scotland would have everything as near as possible to federalism, and he obviously that's been watered down. You had the vow, which was again incredibly laughable in terms of where. So it's not credible. It's absolutely not credible at all. And anybody in Scotland you would believe this. I'll be very surprised if it's if it gains Labour any traction whatsoever in this regard. I think it's Keir Starmer's sop to what he thinks. They're trying to suppose resurrect late Scottish Labour's fortunes. It isn't going to work. We've seen this before. It becomes laughable. They've never delivered over that period of time. And I know we were touching on the social attitude survey, and there's figures behind that again, which kind of backs up in terms of that. But yeah, it almost becomes laughable that Gordon Brown's rolled out every few years, and it's the same policies that are wrapped up and changed ever so slightly. So it's not going to make a difference to Scottish Labour at all.
It's a good point that you make, Paul, and certainly it struck me over the weekend that, if nothing else, you can credit Gordon Brown with incredible persistence. I saw David Cameron described over the weekend as a broken man having been forced from office, whereas Mr. Brown seems to be made of rather stronger stuff insofar as he just keeps coming back with the same old story time and time again. However, Serena, you brought it up, and this is also a link to our final story that we'll get to in a minute, but the British Social Attitudes Survey published this week reports that in 2010, 18% of Labour voters north of the border said independence was the best way for Scotland to be governed, and 70% backed devolution. By 2014, support for independence amongst Labour voters had risen to 23%, and the latest survey, which was taken in 2021, shows that nearly 4 out of 10, 38% of Labour voters in Scotland back independence, while the proportion supporting devolution as the best way has dropped back to 53%. So, Serena, is anyone noticing a trend here amongst Labour voters? And does this polling tell us that even Labour voters don't believe the tales of Brig a Brún that they're being told?
Well, I think it does show how damaging the vow, or rather completely not adhering to the vow, was in the fallout from the 2014 referendum. I mean, I can completely see why people don't trust the Labour Party to actually deliver any meaningful devolution if that was what they asked for. Following that, now we've actually seen many attempted power grabs on laws that we have in Scotland rather than the other way around since then. So I can completely see why if you're a Scottish Labour voter, you would be thinking increasingly that independence was the best way forward. I mean, there's so much really clear non-party political evidence to suggest that independence is the best way for Scotland, whether it be being able to rejoin the EU and all the benefits that brings, or whatever it is. So it's definitely not something that is only in the minds of people who are members of one party. I just find it absolutely. I'm quite befuddled by the Labour leadership in both the north and the south, because they seem to be completely out of touch with. In the case of the Labour leadership in Scotland, completely out of touch with this genuine statistic that almost 1 in 4 Scottish Labour voters want independence. And in the south, Keir Starmer's saying that, talking about electoral issues and electoral reform, he said, electoral reform isn't a priority for them. I'm not really sure what is a priority for him, because I've been waiting for several years now for him to do something meaningful against a absolutely hideous Conservative government, and I've not seen it. So I feel a bit sorry for him. That's all I can really say.
That's pretty damning stuff, Serena. Thank you. And Paul, it struck me that you're the first SNP MSP for East Lothian. And East Lothian was another industrial part of Scotland, or partially industrial part of Scotland, where historically the Labour vote was weighed, it wasn't counted. So in your experience of the way in which politics has changed in East Lothian, Paul, does that reflect what the highly acclaimed British Social Attitude Survey has been telling us over the past 10 or 15 years?
Yeah, very much so. I think if you looked at where the SNP was in East Lothian a number of years ago, it has grown. We've consecutively won Westminster and Holyrood elections. It would be very, again, confident in terms of winning further elections that come up in that regard. So we have seen that, and the demographics behind the survey, which again we'll come on to, are very strong in terms of that. So demographics in East Lothian have changed, and this week we're going to see, you'll see Anna Sarwar being rolled out to give the speech to say what Scottish Labour's doing. Yeah, you see in the Scottish Parliament, time and time they will bring up saying the Scottish Government should be doing this. And of course, the SNP will go back and say, support the powers for enable us to do this. For example, borrowing powers. We have the social justice budget. It's a demand-led budget. We have no borrowing ability. We are in an ironic situation that's with an Angus council has more borrowing abilities than the Scottish Parliament does. It's an absolutely ridiculous position to be in. But Scottish Labour won't support giving additional borrowing powers to the Scottish Government to meet a demand-led budget. Yet they will ask for Scottish Government to do as much as they possibly can in terms of that. And we heard the mitigation already, £720 million. Scottish Government mitigates Westminster policies. Labour won't support the additional powers that we could have right now if they supported it through Westminster, but they won't do that. So it becomes again almost laughable when you hear Gordon Brown saying, we want the Senate of the regions and the nations and so on. They won't support even giving small powers to Scotland that would make a difference for the people of Scotland. They won't even do that. So the hypocrisy is incredible.
Thanks, Paul. As you say, incredible hypocrisy. But let's move on to our final item now this afternoon, because as we've been talking about, the 39th annual British Social Attitudes Survey has sparked headlines last week as it recorded the highest level of support for independence north of the border at 52% and an increase in support for Irish reunification. The survey showed that support for being part of the UK in Northern Ireland had slipped below half at 49%, while support in Northern Ireland for reunification has increased from 14% in 2015 to 30% now. Meanwhile, 52% in Scotland favour independence, and that's the highest ever number found by the survey. This is up from 23% in 2012, when the UK, and that's when, of course, the UK government agreed to an independence referendum that was held 2 years later. So, firstly, Serena, what's your reaction to this reporting of the latest British Social Attitude Survey, and that's research work that was done in 2021?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm delighted, but I'm not surprised. I think it's part of a wider trend. I don't think it's an outlier. This is particularly impressive, and I think, as Paul will probably go into, it's a very well-respected analysis, and there's lots of interesting demographic elements. But to me, it makes complete sense on every level. So yes, I'm delighted, but not surprised.
Thanks, Serena. And Paul, as Serena suggests, we should give you the chance to give us your reaction to the results of this latest British Social Attitude Survey.
Yeah, I mean, again, not surprised. I think when you've seen obviously independence as the main support, years, even just going back 6-7 years ago, the majority support was for devolution rather than independence. Now you've almost seen that flip, and I think that will continue to grow. You've seen the growth within Labour supporters in terms of that. I think just what's happened in the last week or two in terms of Liz Truss and where she's going, again, will widen that gap about where politics are in the rest of the UK compared with Scotland, and people I think will support independence as the best option to go ahead. And they're obviously, I think, the survey itself goes into a lot more detail than that. Again, it comes back to demographics. I think it comes back to in terms of where kind of people see what we should be doing and about taxation to try and support the most vulnerable in society. So there's lots to consider, there's lots to go over. But I think in terms of the independence movement, it's encouraging, and it's seen. I think it's confirming what we're seeing on the ground. And even as I said in the last week or so, where Liz Truss is taking the UK way to the right, this again is going to encourage support for independence. I've no doubt about that.
Well, that's a very good point, Paul. And staying with you for a second, should the independence movement in Scotland now be coming together, perhaps, in order to get a positive campaign rolling as quickly as possible?
I think at the moment one of the key things, obviously, within the movement, I know in East Lothian we're preparing for the referendum. I think one of the key things, obviously, we have the Court of Session decision, which is due probably within the next month or so. I think I think people are almost pausing, ready to go in terms of that. So I know a lot of constituencies are preparing for the independence referendum. I think it's almost, let's wait and see where the Court of Session goes. You've almost then got a timetable to work back on. So yes, we should be looking to do that in terms of that. But again, it comes back. I think there's more pressing questions in terms of that as well. Yes, we should be preparing. We should be looking around about the papers that are coming out, but what kind of Scotland should we be looking for as well? And one of the things that came through in the social attitudes study as well was in terms of people supporting paying more tax to try and support social services. I think the SNP should be brave in that regard. I think the independence movement should be brave and set ourselves aside from the neoliberal, if you like, approach from the Tories down south. We should be brave. We should be looking at our other countries in Scandinavia, for example, around about what they do to support their most vulnerable. So it's a real crossroads again, I think, for the independence movement and the SNP to be brave and support the most vulnerable in our society. We have to be.
Thanks, Paul. That's a very good point. And Serena, finally, the same question for you. Should the independence movement be coming together now to begin to campaign positively and perhaps taking that further? Should it be coming together? And if so, how can it be brought together?
Yeah, so I would argue that we are already working together. I mean, we're certainly campaigning positively where we are in Angus, and I think it's absolutely correct and right to emphasise that the independence movement is not just the SNP. That's not how it works. You know, I'm a very proud member of the SNP, but I joined the independence movement because of the values I hold and how they align with that, and I want an independent Scotland because I believe in a version of Scotland that has those values in it that I don't think we can achieve as part of the UK. So I think when you say bringing people together, by and large, I think we're already working together. I'm very happy and keen to work with anyone who has those same values, and we can all move constructively together in that direction. I think it's absolutely key that because we do have a media in Scotland that is largely hostile to independence, we need to be even more mindful and careful and considered when we make statements and when we talk about independence, because if there is one, as in any movement, there are going to be a very tiny minority of outliers who don't all hold the same values as the mass. And I think we all just need to be really mindful that anything said is going to be weaponized and mobilized against us. So this is the time to absolutely come together and make a really disciplined, concerted push.
Thanks, Serena. That's a very good point that you make. And Paul, taking that point further, developing that point further, is a values-based approach to the independence movement. Is that an approach which will, firstly, bring the movement together, and secondly, deliver a successful outcome in terms of the next referendum?
Yeah, very much so, because I think you're seeing as the travel direction down south by the Conservative government has taken us in a completely different way, and I think, as I said, I think that there tends to be more support for protecting the most vulnerable in our society. Scotland has tended to be left of centre, whether it's been through Labour and now obviously through the SNP. So I think it very much is values based, combined with we need all the powers to tackle this. And the only way to do that is through independence. And the figure you mentioned before was, you said about 3.5% people, changing society and bringing in change in terms of that. Now, we're not talking about people going on the streets. That's obviously part of the marches and so on. What we're talking about, and Serena mentioned it before, is actually going out, knocking doors, speaking to people, and the independence movement, winning people over one by one. That's how we'll win the independence referendum. And I'm confident we'll do that, because I think our case is strengthened every single day when we've got this Conservative government down south wrecking society in terms of that. So I think our case will be strengthened, and we're seeing that through the social attitude survey. People more and more are beginning to support that. And that's on a much more granular level basis as well. It's happening, and I suppose, over that period of time. And I think we'll continue to see that, and that trend will continue. And we will move towards our independence. I have no doubt about that.
Thanks, Paul. A confidence and a clear trend that we're looking forward to reporting on in the weeks and months to come. But I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station, and to make new programmes for you. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland and becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. We've set ourselves a target of 10,000 new subscribers, because that would allow us to employ staff at the station and to produce more programmes. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7. So please tune in and join us again then. I hope that you've enjoyed a tasty full Scottish this afternoon. So thank you to everyone who has been watching, and a very special thanks to our very special guests, Councillor Serena Cowdy and Paul McLennan, MSP. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope that you have a very peaceful Sunday and can join us again here on Broadcasting Scotland very soon. Bye-bye.